Garrett Purcell stood in the hallway of the Meridian Square building, flannel sleeves rolled, hands still smelling of pipe grease. 3 days of work. Done right. Done on time. Frank Sutter slid a paper across the folding table without looking up. Wrong permit form. We're not paying the balance. $200. Not 2,000. Not 2 million. 200. Garrett looked at the paper, then at Frank. Then he nodded, slow and quiet, and walked out without another word. That silence would cost Frank Sutter $4 million. Before we go further, what would you have done in Garrett's shoes? Walk away quiet, or demand the money on the spot? Tell us below. The truck started on the second try, same as always. Garrett drove west across Knoxville into Bearden, past the same oak trees he'd driven past for 6 years, and pulled into the gravel drive of a small rental house with a fence he'd painted himself the summer before. Inside, Owen was already up, spoon in a bowl of cereal gone soft, backpack zipped, and waiting by the chair. 9 years old, hair sticking up on one side. Garrett didn't ask if he'd eaten. He just looked at the bowl, nodded, and made toast anyway. 1 slice for Owen's plate, and 1 wrapped in a paper towel for his own pocket. You gonna be home early today? Owen asked, not looking up from the bowl. I'll try. Owen nodded the way kids nod when they've learned not to expect a straight answer, and went back to his cereal. Garrett noticed. He always noticed. He just didn't say so. After he dropped Owen at school, Garrett didn't drive home right away. He pulled into an empty lot off Kingston Pike, cut the engine, and sat there for 15 minutes with the paper Frank had handed him folded on the passenger seat. Wrong permit form. He knew that wasn't a real thing. Not because he had a feeling about it, because he'd spent years reading contracts for a living, back before the truck and the flannel, and he knew the Tennessee Contractor Licensing Board didn't have an old form, new form distinction. A valid license was valid. Frank had made it up on the spot. The only real question was whether Garrett wanted to spend his evening proving it. He looked at the clock, then at his phone. Then he typed, Tennessee Contractor Licensing Board complaint form. Back at the kitchen table, laptop open, stack of paperwork beside him, Garrett filled out the complaint carefully, not skipping a single field. He attached the signed field report from the site supervisor, time-stamped photos from each stage of the job, and a copy of his own contractor's license, current, correctly formatted, no errors anywhere on it. He hit submit. The screen thanked him for his submission. He closed the laptop and drove to an afternoon job on the north side of town. No triumph in it. No anger either. Just a thing that needed doing, now done. 9 floors up in a building on Henley Street, Dana Colby read an email from Frank's assistant in the elevator on her way up. Complaint filed with the board regarding Meridian Square, need assessment of timeline impact. She was 32, brown hair cut to her shoulders, the same navy blazer she'd worn since the day she got the title. She didn't panic reading it. She set her coffee down, opened the board's portal, and read every line herself. Complaint from a plumbing contractor named Garrett Purcell. $200. Reason for non-payment. Incorrect permit form. She pulled up the contractor's file in Harwell's system. Thin. Just a name, a phone number, and a note, referred by Frank Sutter. That afternoon, she drove out to Meridian Square to check the site herself. Garrett was there too, asked back by the board to supply supplemental documentation. They met in the second-floor hallway, next to an elevator shaft still missing its doors. Dana had a tablet in hand and asked short questions about scope and completion date. Garrett answered each one, nothing extra. He'd brought numbered technical drawings, time-stamped photos from every phase, and the field supervisor's signed reports. She took notes. He wasn't trying to charm her. He was answering the question in front of him and waiting for the next one. That wasn't how most contractors worked a room. Back at her desk, Dana pulled the original bid file for Meridian Square. The plumbing contractor listed on the master agreement wasn't Garrett Purcell at all. It was a company called Southern Flow LLC. But Garrett had done the actual work. Somebody had reassigned the job without an addendum, without a single piece of paper to explain it. She asked her assistant. The assistant said it was Frank's call. She closed the file and looked out the window at Henley Street below, traffic moving the way it always did, and felt, for the first time, that something underneath this project wasn't sitting right. Frank called Dana at 17 minutes past 8 the next morning, before the first meeting of the day. His voice wasn't angry, which was worse. He wanted her to call the board investigator and frame the whole thing as a small procedural misunderstanding. asked for an informal resolution instead of a formal review. Dana asked what legal basis they'd use. The complaint had already been accepted, and only the complainant could withdraw it. Frank went quiet for a second. Then he said, "Dana, you've been here 3 years. You know who decides who moves up in this department." Not a threat exactly, just a reminder. She hung up without saying anything else and sat looking at the phone like it might explain itself. She didn't start digging because she wanted to be a hero. She started because her signature was on a dozen progress reports for Meridian Square, and if there was a violation buried in that file, she needed to know what she'd put her name on. Self-preservation first, everything else after. She pulled every subcontract, every sign-off, every payment record from the beginning of the project. She searched for Southern Flow LLC, the company listed instead of Garrett, registered in Maryville, Tennessee. Nothing else. No contractor's license on file anywhere in Harwell's records. While she was working through the old project emails, Dana found an attachment from 2022, before Harwell even owned the building, a financial feasibility assessment from the early due diligence phase. She opened it. 42 pages, cash flow analysis, operating cost projections, market risk breakdown, every conclusion backed by clean data. On the signature line, Garrett T. Purcell, Senior Financial Analyst, Mercer and Holt Advisory Group, Knoxville, Tennessee. She stopped. She looked back at the name on the complaint form. Garrett Purcell, plumbing contractor, beard and address. Same man. The man Frank had refused $200. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't know what to do with it yet. And when she didn't know, she stayed quiet. But she saved the file to a private folder on her personal laptop. Garrett had left Mercer and Holt in 2023, after the firm sold off its real estate advisory division to a larger group out of Atlanta. His department was folded entirely. No equivalent position in the new structure. No relocation plan that made sense for a single father who wasn't about to uproot his son from the only city Owen had ever known. He'd learned plumbing in 6 months. Reading a blueprint had never been the hard part for a man who used to read balance sheets for a living. That afternoon, the board called both of them in to compare documentation. Garrett laid his materials out in order, field reports, dated photographs, technical notes for every phase. He organized it the way a plumber never would. Numbered, cross-referenced, every signature dated and identified. The investigator asked a routine question about payment procedure, and Garrett answered, then asked one back about the scope of the review, a question sharp enough that the investigator stopped writing and looked up. Dana, sitting across the table, didn't take another note. She was watching. After the session, everyone filed out to the parking lot. The sun had dropped low, light slanting sideways across the asphalt. Dana saw Garrett sitting in his truck, window down, phone to his ear, laughing. Not a polite laugh, not the sound of a man managing stress. A real laugh, the kind you make listening to a 9-year-old tell a story that only makes sense to him. Garrett didn't know anyone was watching. Dana slowed her steps without meaning to. The image, a man in a worn flannel shirt, sitting in an old truck, laughing at whatever his son was saying, didn't match any version of the story she was trying to piece together. And it was exactly that mismatch that mattered. She kept walking. But the image stayed with her longer than she wanted to admit, and there's a reason it would. The board's notice landed in Harwell's inbox the next morning. This was no longer just about $200. In the course of reviewing Garrett's complaint, investigators had found 3 subcontractors listed on Meridian Square without valid Tennessee licenses at the time their contracts were signed. All 3 had been approved directly by Frank Sutter, bypassing Harwell's standard bidding process entirely. The review was expanding. This wasn't a $200 problem anymore. Frank didn't panic. He'd sat at that level of power long enough to believe most problems could be managed if you talked to the right people fast enough. He called his personal attorney. Short call, no notes. He called a longtime contact on the Community Development Board. Same, short, unrecorded. He believed his network could slow the investigation to a crawl. What he hadn't accounted for was that an investigation doesn't ask permission to keep moving. He called Dana into a small conference room at the end of the hall. No witnesses, door closed. He set a folder on the table, weekly progress reports, her signature at the bottom of each one. You've been site supervisor since August, he said. You signed these. If the board finds a violation in that window, your name's on the paper. He wasn't wrong. Her signature was there. But she'd signed based on progress summaries Frank himself had compiled. She'd never had a way to check whether the underlying numbers were accurate, because he was the one filtering what reached her desk. This wasn't an accident. It had been built before she was even assigned the project. She kept her voice level. She didn't deny her signature. She didn't accept blame either. "I need to see the raw progress reports," she said, before they were summarized. Frank looked at her. "Why?" "So I know what I actually signed." He didn't answer, but he didn't refuse either. She walked straight to the restroom, closed the door, and stood at the sink for a minute without moving. She wasn't the type to cry at work, and she didn't now. But her hands were cold, and she needed a full minute before her breathing came back to normal. She understood the shape of the trap. If Frank decided to make her the fall, he had enough paperwork to make it look convincing. And she didn't have enough information yet to push back. That afternoon, a woman approached Garrett in the parking lot outside the board's office on Gay Street. 50 or so, salt and gray hair, wire-rimmed glasses, a beige coat that had seen a few winters. She didn't introduce herself. "You're pulling the right thread," she said, voice low but steady. "You just need to pull it in the right place." She handed him a folded scrap of paper, a contract number, a company name, Ridgeline Contractors, LLC. Then she walked away without looking back. Garrett didn't ask who she was. He recognized the kind of access it took to know a detail like that. Internal accounting, not public record. He put the paper in his inner jacket pocket. That evening, Garrett stopped at a coffee shop on Gay Street to print more documents. His home printer had been broken a week, and he hadn't gotten around to replacing it. Dana was already there, laptop open, coffee gone cold beside her, sitting the way people sit when they don't want to go home yet and don't know why. They didn't share a table. Nobody made the offer. Garrett printed his pages, paid, and turned to leave. He stopped beside her table just long enough to set a folded napkin down next to her laptop, a name and a time written on it. The board investigator's office hours the next morning. No explanation. He walked out. Dana looked at the napkin, then at the door he'd already gone through. She didn't know why he'd done it, but she knew it wasn't politeness. For the first time since this had started, she didn't feel like she was standing in this alone. Pinnacle Capital Partners, out of Nashville, for $1 million invested in Meridian Square, sent Dana an email at 8 the next morning. They'd already heard about the board's investigation, not from Harwell, from a third party. Someone had told them before Harwell had the chance to explain it themselves. The email was short, polite, cold. A formal written explanation required within 72 hours, or they would reconsider commitment terms under Section 14.3. Dana printed it, underlined that clause, and added it to a folder that kept getting thicker by the day. Instead of reporting up to Frank, she worked late into the night. Empty office, fluorescent light, third cup of coffee gone cold. She went back through the entire bid history from the start. A pattern emerged that wasn't coincidence. Every unlicensed subcontractor was registered to an address in Maryville, 30 minutes outside Knoxville. All of them started receiving payments from Harwell right after Frank made partner in early 2021. None of them had a valid Tennessee contractor's license on file anywhere in Harwell's own records. She built a timeline, careful, one entry at a time. She didn't rush to conclusions. She just wrote down what happened and when, and let the dates speak for themselves. Both of them were back at the board's office the next day, submitting supplemental paperwork the investigator had requested. They sat waiting in the same room, plastic chairs against the wall, hospital-style fluorescent light overhead. Nobody made conversation. Garrett read something on his phone. Dana typed on her tablet. At one point, the investigator stepped out and asked Dana a technical question about how progress reports were signed off inside Harwell's process. She explained. When she finished, Garrett added a detail about how similar sign-offs usually worked on the construction side, different from the paperwork side. A small point, but a precise one. The investigator wrote it down. Dana glanced at him. That detail hadn't come from a plumber. It had come from someone who'd read enough contracts to know exactly where the gap lived between what a document said and what actually happened on the ground, and where that gap could hide a violation or, sometimes, protect one. Neither of them said anything more. That evening, Garrett picked Owen up from after-school care and swung by Tyson Park before heading home. Owen took off across the grass without asking permission, the way a kid does once a routine is set in stone. Garrett sat on a bench near the gate, watching, phone left in his pocket. A neighbor from down the street, a mechanic named Bob who ran the garage on the corner, walked past and asked Owen when his next ball game was. Owen hollered back without stopping. Next Saturday, and kept running. Bob clapped Garrett on the shoulder and moved on. This was Garrett Purcell's actual life. A bench, green grass, a kid running further than seemed necessary, a neighbor passing by. Nothing dramatic about it. It didn't need to be. Owen came running back, out of breath, grabbing his father's sleeve. "Dad, next week's the class music thing. Don't forget, it's in the evening." Garrett pulled out his phone and put it in the calendar. Right then it buzzed, a text from an unknown number, no name attached. "Meet me tomorrow. Coffee shop. 7. Alone." Garrett looked at it. He recognized the tone. Short, no greeting, the kind of message from someone used to speaking plainly. He set a reminder and put the phone away. Owen asked who texted him. "Somebody from work," Garrett said. Owen was already running off again before the sentence finished. The coffee shop was empty at 7 the next morning. Carol Prentice was already sitting in the corner booth, coffee untouched in front of her, hands flat on the table like she'd decided on that posture before she'd even sat down. When Garrett sat across from her, she looked him straight in the eye and skipped any introduction. She'd worked in Harwell's accounting department for 11 years. She'd signed a confidentiality agreement when she was hired, no sharing internal financial records with outside parties, and she wasn't planning to break that. But she'd also been the one who flagged a set of irregular payments to her supervisor late last year, and Frank had brushed it off, then had her quietly move to a role with less access to sensitive numbers. She understood exactly why she'd been pushed to the edges. She knew too much. She didn't hand him internal documents. She gave Garrett 3 LLC registration numbers, all public record, all searchable through the Tennessee Secretary of State. "Look up the registered agent on these 3, she said. "Just look it up. I'm not saying anything more." She took one sip of coffee, her first, stood up, left cash under the cup, and was out the door before Garrett finished his own. He watched her go. He didn't thank her. She'd moved too fast for that. And both of them understood this wasn't the kind of meeting that needed a thank you. That afternoon, Garrett drove to the Lawson McGee Public Library on Church Avenue and used one of the public terminals, avoiding any question about where the search had come from. He pulled up the Secretary of State's business search and entered the 3 numbers Carol had given him one at a time. Southern Flow LLC, Ridgeline Contractors LLC, and Blue Ridge Site Services LLC. All 3 formed within 4 months of Meridian Square going out to bid. All 3 listed the same registered agent, a small law office on Market Street, run by Thomas Arkin, Frank Sutter's personal attorney. Every piece of it was public record. No confidentiality agreement needed. Just knowing where to look. Garrett wasn't a lawyer, but he'd spent enough years as an analyst to recognize what it meant when 3 companies were formed by the same hand, at the same time, right before a major contract went out. Not coincidence. He built a table, old habit, one he'd never fully let go of. Each company its own column, formation date, registered agent, contract date with Harwell, license status. Clean logic, source data, no conclusion that wasn't backed by a number. That same afternoon, Frank called Dana into another meeting, this time with an outside attorney sitting silent in the corner, laptop open. Frank slid a draft across the table, a letter to Pinnacle Capital, explaining that Garrett Purcell's complaint was a procedural misunderstanding, already resolved, that the board's review was being coordinated internally, and that project timelines remained unaffected. 7 paragraphs. Every one a lie sitting under her signature line. She read each paragraph, slowly, no rushing. Then she set the pen down, not thrown, just set down. "I need more time to look at this," she said. Frank's eyes didn't threaten this time, just went cold. "Dana, don't put yourself on the wrong side of this." She stood and walked out. The attorney in the corner never looked up. She stood on the sidewalk outside the Harwell building, October wind strong enough to pin her hair back. She didn't call anyone. She looked at her phone. The investigator's number still saved from the napkin Garrett had left 3 days earlier. She'd looked at that number twice already without dialing. She wasn't even sure who she'd be protecting by calling. Garrett, herself, both. Then she realized the question didn't matter. What mattered was that she was standing on a sidewalk with a phone in her hand, and Frank was 9 floors up waiting for her signature. She didn't go back upstairs. She got in her car and drove straight to the board's office. She'd made her choice, and it would carry through everything that came next. Dana got to the board's office before regular hours the next morning. No appointment, no lawyer, nobody from Harwell beside her. She sat across from the investigator and said plainly she wasn't there to withdraw Garrett Purcell's complaint, and she wasn't there on Harwell's behalf either. She was there on her own, with information she believed was relevant. She laid out the patterns she'd found, the subcontractor timeline, the Maryville addresses, when the payments had started. No internal documents. She knew where her own legal line sat, but enough for the investigator to know exactly where to look in public records. He wrote without stopping. At the end he asked, "You understand this could affect your position at Harwell?" "I understand," she said. He nodded. She left. Before she'd come in that morning, Dana had stopped by her office to grab a file. Her assistant had left a folder on her desk, a full vetting packet on every contractor tied to Meridian Square, requested by the board as supplemental material. She flipped through it fast and stopped on Garrett Purcell's page. Standard background check, name, address, license number, and an employment history compiled from broker records. The last line read, Mercer and Holt Advisory Group, Senior Financial Analyst, 2019 to 2023. Reason for departure. Department elimination following acquisition. Dana went still. She read it again. Then she remembered the 2022 feasibility report she'd saved 3 days earlier, Garrett's signature at the bottom. She remembered how he'd organized his documents at the board, the question he'd asked back to the investigator. The table he might have built. She had no proof, but she knew. The last piece clicked into place. The man Frank had refused $200. The man Frank assumed was just a plumber who'd give up after one refusal. That man had spent years reading the exact kind of financial and legal structure Meridian Square was built on, and understood precisely what was wrong with it. Frank had no idea, and that was the reason Frank had already lost from the very first day, without knowing it. Dana set the folder down, put her coat on, and drove to the board's office. Garrett was there that same morning too, not by any plan, just coincidence of timing. He submitted the supplemental file he'd finished building the night before, public records, the LLC timeline, the connection to the registered agent. The investigator read it on the spot. He looked up. "You put this together yourself?" "I had the time," Garrett said. The investigator studied him for a second, then nodded and kept reading. That afternoon, after leaving the board's office, Garrett sat on the front steps outside, phone to his ear checking in with Owen's afternoon sitter. Dana came out about 5 minutes behind him. They looked at each other for a second, both of them knowing exactly what the other had just done inside that building, though neither had told the other in advance. Neither asked. Dana stood near a support column, didn't sit. A silence passed that didn't feel uncomfortable. Then she said, "You know they'll try to blame whoever's easiest to blame." Garrett didn't look up right away. Then he said, "You're not the easiest to blame. You're just the one they've put in that spot." She looked at him. It wasn't comfort. No, it'll be fine. No soft landing. It was analysis. And because it was analysis, it landed harder than comfort would have. Dana nodded once and walked off. Her steps were steadier going out than they'd been coming in. Garrett watched her go, then went back to his phone. Frank found out the next morning that Carol Prentice had been seen sitting with Garrett at the coffee shop 2 days earlier. A tip from another employee, not anyone investigating, just someone who'd noticed and thought it worth mentioning. Frank called Carol into a conference room. No attorney this time, no witness. He asked her directly. She neither confirmed nor denied. She sat up straight and said, "I haven't shared any internal information. If you have evidence otherwise, I'll be speaking with my attorney." Frank suspended her before the meeting even ended, the paperwork citing violation of company confidentiality policy, vague enough to need no proof at all. Carol packed her desk in 15 minutes and left without a word to anyone. But she'd already done what she needed to do. Suspending Carol was the biggest mistake Frank made after that first morning in the hallway. Not because she'd retaliate, but because the action left a paper trail. Internal suspensions have to be logged with HR. Reasons have to be documented. And Harwell's HR system could be pulled into the expanded investigation. Frank hadn't thought that far when he signed off on it. That afternoon, the board issued a formal notice. The review was expanding to cover the full subcontractor chain on Meridian Square, everything approved since February of the previous year. The entire project was placed under legal hold. No further construction, no further disbursement, until the review concluded. The notice went out simultaneously to Harwell, to every subcontractor named, and, as standard procedure required, to Pinnacle Capital Partners as the registered investment partner. Pinnacle got the board's notice at the same time Harwell did. Within 2 hours, they emailed Dana directly again, not Frank, not the CEO. An emergency meeting required at 9 the next morning, and if the board confirmed a violation within the scope of Section 14.3, they would trigger the withdrawal clause immediately. Dana read it in an empty office, the only light coming from her laptop screen. She knew Section 14.3 by heart. She'd read the whole agreement the day she took over the project. If Pinnacle pulled out, the $4 million was gone, and Harwell would need someone to answer for it. She hadn't signed the agreement with Pinnacle, but her name was on the progress reports. That night, once Owen was asleep and the house had gone quiet, Garrett sat at the kitchen table with his laptop, a borrowed printer from a neighbor, papers spread across the surface. He pulled everything together one more time. The public records from the Secretary of State, his own field reports, the analysis of the 3 LLCs, every date in the timeline. Every claim had a source attached, nothing unsupported. He read it through again, checking the logic, checking the dates, checking every source. This wasn't how a plumber who'd been shorted $200 handled things. This was how someone used to building files that had to survive professional scrutiny handled things. He emailed it to the investigator at 11:47 that night. Subject line: supplemental documentation, Purcell versus Harwell. No emotional closing statement. No appeal to fairness. Just the paperwork. Close to midnight, Dana's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. No name. Look at the sign-off dated October 14th. Frank signed before the technical report existed. She couldn't sleep. She opened her laptop and logged into Harwell's system. October 14th. Frank approving the first subcontractor. The technical report confirming eligibility was dated October 18th. 4 days later, he'd signed off before there was any technical basis to sign off on at all. Not an oversight. Not a wrong date. He'd approved something with no grounds to approve it. On purpose. Dana sat staring at the screen. Her hands didn't shake, but her breathing slowed, the way it does when you realize you've been standing at the edge of something without knowing it. She closed the laptop. She lay down, but didn't close her eyes. The meeting with Pinnacle happened in Harwell's main conference room the next morning. Long table, leather chairs, the company logo on the wall. On Harwell's side, CEO Thomas Greeley, Frank Sutter, and Dana Colby. On Pinnacle's side, 2 representatives from Nashville, laptops open, no smiles. Frank opened with, "This is a procedural misunderstanding." Dana set her hand lightly on the table, not a big gesture, just enough to stop him. Then she started. She laid out the actual timeline. October 14th, Frank approving the first subcontractor. October 18th, the technical report confirming eligibility only arriving 4 days later. November 3rd, the first complaint filed with the board by a contractor refused $200. She didn't name anyone. She didn't say the word fraud. She just laid out dates and events in order and let the sequence speak for itself. The Pinnacle representatives took notes. Greeley sat still. Frank didn't interrupt again. After 18 minutes, Pinnacle senior representatives said they would trigger Section 14.3 that same day. That afternoon, the board formally announced Frank Sutter's suspension from the Knoxville Community Development Board for the duration of the investigation, citing a serious conflict of interest tied to the subcontractor approval process. Public record under Tennessee's transparency laws. It spread fast, not front-page news, just a short item in the local paper. But in a real estate market as small and interconnected as Knoxville's, a short item carried the weight of a headline. The investigator called Garrett at almost 4 that afternoon. Flat voice, no color to it. His complaint had been fully confirmed. The refusal to pay $200, citing an incorrect permit form, had no legal basis whatsoever. Harwell would be ordered to repay it within 7 business days. And the file Garrett submitted the night before was now part of the official record supporting the investigation. Garrett nodded once, even though the man on the phone couldn't see it, and said thanks. He hung up. He sat in the truck a minute, didn't call anyone, didn't post anything. He started the engine and drove to pick up Owen from school. That evening Dana drove out to Bearden without much of a reason. She had nothing new to say, no information to pass along. She just knew the day had closed out something, and she didn't want to close it out alone in her car. She parked near Sequoia Elementary. She knew the address from the file. She wasn't sure Garrett would still be there. But the old Ram was in the lot, and Garrett stood beside it, hands in his pockets, watching the front doors. Owen came running out, backpack bouncing, one shoe untied. Garrett crouched to fix it before Owen had even fully stopped. Dana stood by her own car, didn't walk over right away. She watched. This man had held steady through 10 days. Not because he wanted to be anyone's hero, but because he knew he was right and wasn't going to let someone else decide otherwise. She got out. Garrett looked up. Owen looked too. The board confirmed it, she said, simple. Garrett nodded, a nod that already knew, needing nothing more. Owen tugged his father's sleeve. Who's that, Dad? Someone I work with, Garrett said. Owen waved at Dana, polite and a little formal. She waved back. The three of them stood there in the October light on a sidewalk in Sequoia, nobody needing to say anything else. The board met the next morning and issued its full public statement by 11 o'clock. All three subcontractors on Meridian Square, Southern Flow LLC, Ridgeline Contractors LLC, and Blue Ridge Site Services LLC, were confirmed to have operated without valid Tennessee licenses at the time their contracts were signed. Every payment tied to those three companies, $612,000 across 9 months, was flagged as a contract violation. Frank Sutter's board membership was revoked permanently, not suspended, not censured, permanent. His file was referred to the Knox County District Attorney's Office to investigate possible bid fraud and violation of public contracting law. The heaviest outcome the board had the authority to issue. Everything past this point belonged to the prosecutor. Pinnacle Capital formally triggered the cancellation clause that same afternoon. The $4 million never reached Harwell. Meridian Square shut down completely. The construction fencing still up, the crane sitting idle, not a single worker on site. Within 48 hours of the board's announcement, 3 other potential partners quietly withdrew from talks with Harwell, no explanation offered. Knoxville's market was small enough that one public notice could shadow the whole next year. All of it traced back to a $200 complaint Frank Sutter had believed he could bury just by refusing to pay it. Harwell's leadership called Dana in, CEO Thomas Greeley, no Frank, since Frank was no longer around to be called anywhere. Greeley didn't have much to say beyond the fact that Dana was the only person in that department who'd handled the whole thing the right way. Her position stayed intact. New projects would take time. Harwell had a reputation to rebuild after this. But she was still director of development. Before she agreed to stay, she asked for one thing. Carol Prentice reinstated in full, and the confidentiality agreement tied to the Meridian Square matter waived for her. Greeley was quiet for a moment. Then he agreed. The email from Greeley reached Carol that evening. Full reinstatement effective the next day, the suspension wiped from her record. No formal apology. That wasn't how Harwell worked. But the email included one line. Your contribution to the integrity of our internal process is recognized. Carol read it at home, closed her laptop, and made herself a cup of tea. She didn't call anyone that night. She didn't need to. An envelope arrived at the house in Bearden, a check from Harwell Realty Group, exactly $200. No letter, no apology attached. Garrett left it on the kitchen table most of the afternoon. That night, after Owen was asleep, he deposited it into the same account he used to cover Owen's after-school activity fees. $200. Enough, in the end, to bring down a $4 million project, because the man who received it understood exactly what was standing behind it. 3 weeks later, the maples on Gay Street had gone fully gold, enough leaves down that people had to watch their footing. Garrett was working a small plumbing job in an office building on the east side of town, an ordinary job on an ordinary schedule. In those 3 weeks, he'd taken 2 calls from old contacts, one from a consulting firm in Atlanta, one from a new investment group in Nashville. Neither said exactly how they'd found his name, but Garrett had enough experience to know. It had shown up in the board's public report, and anyone who knew how to read that kind of report understood exactly what it implied about the man behind it. He hadn't called either one back yet. He was thinking it over, not anxious about it, just letting the question sit a while before answering it. Owen's class music recital fell that same week. Garrett sat in the second row, a newer flannel than usual, hair combed flatter than it usually was. Owen played the drums, not brilliant, not bad. He hit the important beat right, missed one in the middle, and kept going anyway. Garrett clapped like every other parent in the room. But when Owen scanned the crowd looking for his father and found him, the boy grinned the way only a kid can, his whole face, nothing held back. Garrett nodded. That was enough. Dana was walking through Market Square on her lunch break, no jacket even though the air had turned colder, a coffee in hand from the corner shop. She saw Garrett sitting on a bench near the fountain, eating a sandwich, looking at something on his phone. He looked up and saw her at the same moment she saw him. Neither one moved first. Dana walked over and sat down beside him. No asking permission, no hesitation, like she'd already decided before her feet did. "Did you know I found the report you signed back in 2022? She said. Garrett looked at her. "When?" "That first Saturday, before I met with the investigator." He nodded. No explanation, no apology for the gap between what she knew and what he'd never mentioned. She asked why he'd gone into plumbing. He answered without flinching. His department got folded, no equivalent role in the new structure, and he wasn't willing to uproot Owen from Knoxville. He'd learned the trade in 6 months. Reading a blueprint had never been hard for a man who used to read balance sheets. Not a tragedy, not something he needed her to admire. Just a series of practical decisions made by a man with clear priorities who didn't need anyone else to confirm they were right. Dana listened. She didn't treat the answer like something to pity or applaud. She just nodded, the way people do when they understand. They sat a while without talking. A maple leaf drifted down from the tree above the bench, slow in the wind. Birdsong. Traffic somewhere off in the distance. Afternoon light cutting sideways through what leaves were left. Garrett asked, casual as asking about the weather, "You doing all right?" After all of it. Dana looked down at the coffee in her hands. A second passed. Then she said, "I still have my job. Carol still has hers. You've got your $200. He laughed, quiet, not forced, the kind of laugh that comes out because a thing is simply true and there's no arguing with it. She laughed too. The first time in this whole story she'd laughed because something was actually funny, not because the moment called for politeness. When Garrett stood to go, she didn't get up right away. She watched him for a second. Then, before she let herself think too hard about it, she said, "If you ever end up needing someone to read a real estate contract, I know a guy." Garrett stopped. He turned back and looked at her. A pause, short, not uncomfortable, full in the way only two people who'd been through 10 days together could make it feel full. "I'll keep that in mind," he said. He walked off. She watched until he turned the corner out of sight. Neither one gave it a name. But both of them knew this wasn't the last of it.